The woman lay in the dark alley, blood slowly seeping across the cold pavement, and Harlow had almost walked right past her, just 3 more steps, just ignoring that faint broken moan in the dark, just keeping on toward home the way she did after every overtime shift. If she'd done that, this story would never have happened, and neither would the life that came after it. Chicago that night was bitter enough to cut the skin, the kind of cold that sank into bone, the kind that made you drop your head and hurry. The sky was a solid sheet of black with not a single star. December wind screamed between the worn, old buildings on the south side. Harlow pulled her thin coat tight around herself and moved through the familiar alley she'd walked hundreds of times. She was tired. She was hungry. She was drained to the marrow. In her pocket, she had exactly $52, money meant for pain medication for her grandmother, who was lying in a hospital bed. Hours on her feet in the emergency department. Hours without eating, without sitting, without resting. A shift from hell, finally over, and she still had to walk home because she couldn't afford a taxi. And the last bus had been gone for hours. Harlow Sinclair, a young woman, a nurse, graduated with honors, worked like a slave, and still poor as dirt. Life kept doing this to her year after year. She tried. She tried with everything she had, and it was never enough. She lowered her head and hurried through the alley, and then she heard it. A moan, thin and weak, like an injured cat. But it wasn't a cat. Harlow stopped, her heart cinched tight. She looked toward the darkness behind a trash bin. At first, she thought it was a garbage bag. Then she saw a hand, a human hand. Harlow ran to her. The woman was lying there, turned on her side, her back against the cold brick wall. Her clothes were expensive but disheveled, torn. Silver hair had come loose, spilling over a pale face. Blood from a wound on her head ran down her cheek, down her throat, and onto the filthy alley floor. Her lips were blue. Her breathing came in broken pulls, weakening by the second. Harlow dropped to her knees, the nurse in her taking over. She pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck. The pulse was there, thread thin, but it was there. She was still alive? Harlow grabbed her phone and called 911. The voice on the other end was flat, almost bored. South Side. The wait time for an ambulance is at least 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The woman would be dead before anyone arrived. In that moment, fear crashed in. Harlow glanced around the black mouth of the alley. The attacker could still be here. She was a woman alone, unarmed. She could be in danger. She could get dragged into something. She could just leave. She'd called the police, hadn't she? They would come. It wasn't her problem. But something stronger than fear rose in her chest. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Harlow, never step over someone who needs help, because one day it might be you who needs someone to stop. She couldn't leave her here. Harlow pulled off her coat and wrapped it around the woman's head to slow the bleeding. She slid an arm beneath the woman's back and tried to lift her. The body was heavier than she expected, or maybe she was simply too exhausted, but she still stood up. She still moved forward step by step, staggering through the cutting cold. Her breath came fast, her muscles shook. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but her heart wouldn't listen. St. Mary's Hospital was a 15-minute walk from there with a dying woman on her back. 15 minutes felt like 15 years. Harlow didn't know that the person fading against her shoulder was Vivian Hawthorne, the mother of Ronan Whitaker, the mafia boss who terrified all of Chicago. She didn't know that on the other side of the city, the most powerful man in Chicago was tearing the world apart to find his mother. She didn't know that when their 2 worlds collided, nothing would ever be the same. Harlow knew only one thing: someone needed saving, and that small act was about to change everything. This story is long. It's full of surprises, full of tears, and full of moments that will make your heart break open. If you want to walk with Harlow to the end of the road, press the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. Like this video if you believe kindness is repaid, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story, because sometimes one story really can change an entire life. Harlow sat on the icy plastic chair outside the emergency room, her hands still smeared with the blood of a stranger. The clock on the wall read 3:30 in the morning. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the steady beep of machines drifted out from behind the closed door. She'd been sitting there for more than an hour now, since the doctors had rushed Vivian's gurney into emergency surgery. A severe concussion and a deep scalp laceration, they'd said. Significant blood loss. Surgery immediately to close the wound and check for internal pressure. Harlow had nodded like a machine and signed the consent form, because there was no one else here. No one knew who the woman was. No one came looking for her. Only Harlow, a broke nurse with $52 in her pocket, sitting here praying for a stranger. She closed her eyes and memory crashed over her like floodwater. Years earlier, Harlow was a child. That day was a Saturday, 1 week before the school performance. Little Harlow had begged her mother to take her to buy a new pair of shoes. Lila, her mother, had just gotten off a night shift at the factory. Dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, yet she still smiled and nodded. "All right, my little princess. I'll take you." They got in the car. Harlow sat in the back seat, legs swinging, singing under her breath. Lila drove, turning now and then to smile at her daughter. Then everything happened too fast. Blinding headlights, the shriek of a truck horn, metal slamming into metal, glass shattering. Then silence. When Harlow woke up in the hospital, she asked where her mother was. No one answered. They only looked at her with pity. Then Evelyn arrived, pulled her into her arms and sobbed, "Your mom's gone, Harlow, your mom's gone." In the days that followed, Harlow heard adults whispering. If the girl hadn't insisted on buying shoes that day, if Lila hadn't indulged her, poor thing, orphaned so young, those words sank into her heart like knives. Harlow began to believe she'd killed her mother. Every night she clutched her pillow and cried, calling for her mother in dreams, then waking with the pillow soaked through with tears. Evelyn tried to heal the wound inside her granddaughter. She held Harlow and said, "It wasn't your fault." But Harlow didn't believe her. She never did. On the first anniversary of her mother's death, Harlow stood at the grave. A young girl, thin and ghost pale. She knelt down and laid her hand on the cold headstone. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I asked to go that day. I'm sorry you died instead of me." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I promise you I'll save as many people as I can. I'll never leave anyone behind. Never." That was why she became a nurse. That was why she worked long hours without complaining. That was why she couldn't leave Vivian in the dark alley tonight. The operating room door opened, yanking Harlow back to the present. She shot to her feet, her heart pounding. The doctor stepped out, pulled down his mask, his face exhausted but his eyes relieved. "Are you the one who brought her in?" Harlow nodded. "She's out of immediate danger. We stopped the bleeding and relieved the intracranial pressure, but there's a problem." Harlow held her breath. She has temporary memory loss. It could be the trauma. It could be shock. She doesn't remember who she is, doesn't remember her family, doesn't remember what happened. We don't know her name. The doctor looked at Harlow. "Do you know who she is?" Harlow shook her head. "I found her in an alley. She had no identification, no phone. I don't know who she is." The hospital registered Vivian under the name Jane Doe, an unidentified woman. No insurance, no family. No one came to claim her. Harlow stood outside the recovery room and looked through the glass. The woman lay there with bandages wrapped around her head, her face pale, breathing in an even rhythm with the help of machines. A stranger. But Harlow had made a promise at her mother's grave years ago. She wouldn't leave anyone behind. "Ma'am," Harlow whispered through the glass, "I don't know who you are, but someone's looking for you. I promise I'll stay here until you remember everything." At the same time, on the other side of the city, in a grand mansion on the North Shore, Ronan Whitaker shattered the third table of the night. His mother had been missing for hours, and someone was going to pay. The Whitaker mansion sat in silence on the North Shore, where the wealthiest people in Chicago lived. Inside his dark study, lit only by the fire in the hearth, Ronan Whitaker sat motionless in a leather chair, one hand around a glass of whiskey that had gone cold long ago. A man in his 30s. Steel gray eyes, a faint scar running from his temple down to his cheekbone, like a reminder of a blood-soaked past. On the desk, among files and documents, there was only a single photograph, a picture of his mother, Vivian Hawthorne, taken on her birthday. She was smiling, the gentle smile Ronan loved more than anything in the world. The door flew open. Dante Rossi, Ronan's right-hand man for years, stepped in with a face gone pale. Dante had never looked that pale. "Boss," Dante said, his voice shaking. "Something's happened. Mrs. Vivian. Her car was attacked on the way back from the cemetery. The driver is dead. She's missing." The whiskey glass slipped from Ronan's hand and shattered on the floor. He didn't feel the sting when a shard of glass cut his skin. He felt only the blood in his body turning to ice. What? One word, cold as winter. Dante swallowed. "We found the car miles from the cemetery. It was rammed. The driver was shot. Mrs. Vivian wasn't there. No trace." Ronan stood, walked out of the mansion, got into his car, and tore toward the scene. His mother's black Mercedes lay on the roadside, the front end crushed, the windows blown out. The police had been bought, kept the scene untouched for him. Ronan climbed into the car and sat down in the back seat where his mother always sat. The familiar scent of her perfume still lingered. On the floor, he saw the embroidered handkerchief he'd given her last year. It was soaked with blood. Ronan picked it up, his hand trembling. He pulled out his phone and dialed his mother. It rang and rang. No answer. "Mom," Ronan whispered into the emptiness. "Where are you?" And memory surged up, cruel and razor-sharp. Years earlier, Ronan was a teenager. That night, he'd been doing homework in his room when he heard gunshots. He ran down the stairs and saw his father, Harlan Hawthorne, the most powerful boss in Chicago at the time, sprawled on the floor. Blood poured from his chest, spreading across the white marble. His mother, Vivian, was on her knees beside him, screaming, trying to press her bare hands over the wound. And the man holding the gun stood there, face like ice. Lorenzo Russo, his father's right-hand man, the man his father trusted most. "Why?" Harlan asked, blood bubbling at his lips. Russo smiled. "For money, Harlan. It's that simple." Then he fired again. Harlan Hawthorne died in front of his son. Vivian pulled Ronan against her, covered the boy's eyes, but he'd already seen everything. His father's blood, the traitor's smile, his mother's desperate sobs. From that night on, Ronan Whitaker was no longer a boy who laughed easily. He became the man all of Chicago feared. He built an empire from his father's ashes, cold and ruthless, yet holding one vow at the center of his heart: protect his mother at any cost. And now his mother was missing. Ronan stepped out of the car, his eyes bloodshot but dry. He'd forgotten how to cry years ago. Dante waited outside with other men, all of them silent, all of them waiting for orders. "Mobilize everyone," Ronan said, his voice low as thunder. "Men, search every street in Chicago. Pull every security camera, every hospital, every morgue. Call our police. Find her." Dante nodded, and Russo. Ronan turned, and his eyes were no longer cold. They burned like hell. "Investigate whether he's behind this. If he is," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. In the hours that followed, Chicago sank into a silent storm. Ronan's people appeared everywhere, from the darkest alleys to the richest neighborhoods. Security footage was accessed, witnesses were questioned, the underground information network was activated. but there was no sign of Vivian. She was as if she'd evaporated from the earth. Then Dante brought information that made Ronan grit his teeth. "Boss, we found out Mrs. Vivian dismissed her security on her own. She wanted to visit Mr. Harlan's grave alone. She's done it many times before, but this time, Ronan drove his fist into the wall, cracking the plaster. His mother hated being guarded. She often said, 'I'm a prisoner in my own home.' He knew that, but he hadn't thought she'd risk something like this, and now she was out there somewhere. Maybe hurt, maybe bleeding, maybe calling his name while he couldn't hear her." Ronan stood at the office window and looked out over Chicago in the rising dawn. Somewhere out there, his mother was waiting. Alive or dead, he didn't know. But he knew one thing. "Anyone who touched my mother," Ronan said into the darkness, his voice a curse dragged up from hell, "will beg to die." He didn't know that miles away, in the poor St. Mary's Hospital on the south side, his mother was lying in a hospital bed. And the person who had saved her, the person who had carried her through the cutting cold, was only a thin young nurse with $52 in her pocket. Weeks had passed since that fateful night. Vivian was out of immediate danger, but her memory was still a blank sheet of paper. She remembered her first name was Vivian. Nothing more. No last name, no home, no sense that anyone was searching for her. St. Mary's Hospital couldn't keep her forever. No insurance, no identification, no family member coming to claim her. The bill had climbed to more than $8,000, and the hospital had started pressing. Harlow stood at the front desk, pulled out the last of her savings, the money she'd been putting aside to buy Evelyn's medication this month. She placed it on the counter and said in a voice that sounded strangely calm, "I'll take her to my place. I know it isn't ideal, but it's better than her being discharged to a public shelter in this state until she remembers everything." Harlow's apartment was on the 5th floor of an old building with no elevator on the south side, the part of Chicago people called the Forgotten Zone. She helped Vivian up each flight of stairs, Vivian still weak after surgery. When Harlow opened the door, shame rose in her throat. The room was only 25 square meters. The walls were stained with damp and mold, the paint peeling off in sheets. The heater had been broken for years. In winter, she survived with a few thin blankets against the cold. Tape lined the window to keep the wind from slipping in. One narrow bed, one small table, a mini fridge that hummed day and night. That was everything Harlow had. Vivian looked around the room, and Harlow saw something flicker in her eyes. Not disgust, not pity, pain. Even without knowing who she was, Vivian could feel the difference. She knew she didn't belong here, but she said nothing. She only took Harlow's hand and smiled. "You opened your door to a stranger. This is the most beautiful place I've ever seen." Harlow almost cried at those words. In the days that followed, they learned how to live together. Harlow gave Vivian the bed and slept on the battered old chair in the corner. She worked night shifts at the hospital, came home to care for Vivian, then went back again. They shared plain meals, canned soup, bread, sometimes nothing but white rice porridge with a pinch of salt. Vivian never complained. She even insisted on helping Harlow with the housework, even when Harlow tried to stop her. Once Vivian tried to use the gas stove to boil water, but she didn't know how to light it. Harlow had to show her, and they laughed together, a rare sound in the cold little room. Vivian said, "I don't remember who I am, but I'm sure there's no gas stove in my home." Harlow laughed. "I'm guessing your house has a private chef." Vivian tilted her head, thinking, then shook it. "I don't remember, but it could be." They talked more. Vivian spoke about scattered fragments of memory, a large house, a man she loved, a deep sorrow she couldn't explain. Harlow talked about Evelyn, about nursing, about the nights she cried alone because she was so tired. They began to cling to each other like mother and daughter, even though they'd known each other for less than a week. Then the 5th night came. Harlow was dozing on the chair when she jolted awake. There was a sound at the door, a soft scraping, like someone clawing at the wood. Her heart seized. Vivian's attacker. They'd found her. They were here. Harlow rose silently, went to the kitchenette, and took the biggest knife she owned. She stood behind the door with both hands wrapped around the handle, her body shaking, barely daring to breathe. Vivian slept on the bed, unaware. The sound continued, then stopped, then started again. Harlow stood there all night, eyes fixed on the door, not closing them for a second. If someone came in, she would fight. She would protect this woman at any cost. Dawn light slipped through the edge of the window. Harlow opened the door, the knife still in her hand, and she saw it. A skinny stray cat, dirty gray fur, curled up on the floor in front of her apartment. It looked up at Harlow with hungry eyes and let out a weak meow. Harlow lowered the knife, sank down and laughed, laughing with tears. She'd stayed awake all night because of a cat, but the fear was still there. Someone had attacked Vivian. Someone could come back, and Harlow knew she couldn't protect her forever. Inside the room, Vivian had woken up. She stared out the window, and shards of memory began to flash behind her eyes. A man's face, gray eyes, a scar, a name, Ronan. She didn't remember clearly yet, but she knew that somewhere out there, someone was looking for her. Weeks had passed since that fateful night in the dark alley. Vivian sat on the worn chair by the window, helping Harlow fold the laundry that had just dried. It had become their routine every afternoon, right before Harlow left for her night shift. In the corner of the room, the small television was running the evening news, the sound slipping through like background noise that neither of them really heard, until the anchor's voice landed on a phrase that made Vivian freeze in place. The mysterious disappearance of an upper-class Chicago woman remains unsolved after weeks. Police refuse to release the victim's identity at the family's request, but sources say she's a member of a powerful North Shore family. Her private driver died at the scene. If anyone has information, please call the hotline. No photo, no name, but the description of a black Mercedes, the location near Rose Hill Cemetery, the timing weeks ago. Everything matched perfectly. Vivian let the shirt slip from her fingers, and memory came roaring back like a tidal wave. She remembered everything. The cemetery, Harlan's grave, her husband, the man she loved who had died years earlier. She'd slipped away from her security to visit him alone, the way she always did whenever she needed silence. On the way back, the car was hit, the crunch of metal, the crack of gunfire, the driver collapsing over the steering wheel. She'd forced the door, crawled out, and ran into the nearest alley. But they chased her. She saw the attacker's face, cold and ruthless. Silas Vaughn, the trusted enforcer of Lorenzo Russo, the man who had killed her husband years ago. He caught her, knocked her to the ground, and stripped her purse and phone. "Hello, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said with a vicious smile. "Send my regards to your son." Then he kicked her in the head, and darkness swallowed everything. Vivian Hawthorne, widow of Harlan Hawthorne, mother of Ronan Whitaker, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. She trembled, tears streaming down her cheeks. Harlow rushed to her and wrapped her in her arms. "Mrs. Vivian, what is it? Did you remember something?" Vivian looked up at the young woman with those worried eyes, the girl who had saved her life, cared for her for days, shared every plain meal with her. She had to tell the truth. "Harlow," Vivian said, her voice thick with emotion. "I remember now. I know who I am. I'm Vivian Hawthorne." Harlow frowned. "Hawthorne?" Vivian nodded, tears still falling. "Ronan Whitaker's mother. People call my son the mafia boss of Chicago." Harlow took a step back, as if she'd been shocked by electricity. Whitaker. In Chicago, everyone knew that name. The papers called them the most powerful family in the city. People whispered about bloody hits, about an underground empire that controlled Chicago itself, and Harlow had sheltered the mafia boss's mother for the past days. She pulled out her phone and typed Vivian Hawthorne Chicago into the search bar with trembling fingers. The result appeared immediately. A photograph from last year's charity event. Vivian Hawthorne, a woman of means, widow of the late businessman Harlan Hawthorne, mother of Ronan Whitaker, chairman of Whitaker Group. The woman in the photo was smiling softly, wearing an elegant evening gown, silver hair pinned up with aristocratic grace. It was the same woman sitting here in Harlow's 25-square-meter room, wearing the old sweater Harlow had lent her. Harlow went pale. She'd saved the mother of a mafia boss. She'd sheltered her in her home. She knew too much. In the world of people like the Whitakers, knowing too much often meant death. Vivian saw the fear in Harlow's eyes. She understood. She took Harlow's hand, her voice grave. "Harlow, listen to me. You saved my life. But if Russo finds out you helped me, you'll be in danger. You should stay away. Forget me. Pretend you never met me." Harlow looked at the woman in front of her. Vivian wasn't only the mafia boss's mother. She was the woman who'd laughed with Harlow while learning how to use a gas stove. She was the woman who'd held Harlow's hand when Harlow talked about her mother. She was the woman who'd eaten canned soup with her without complaining once. She was a stranger who had become family in short days. "You're not a bad person," Harlow said, her voice shaking but firm. "Whatever your son does, that's not you. I'm not leaving you." Vivian cried. She pulled Harlow into her arms, the way she would have held the daughter she'd never had. "I'll call Ronan," she said. "My son will come for me, and I promise I won't let anyone hurt you." She borrowed Harlow's phone, her hand shaking as she dialed the only number she still knew by heart. It rang once, twice. Then someone picked up. Silence on the other end. Vivian spoke, her voice breaking. "Ronan, it's Mom." On the other end, the silence stretched like a century. Then a voice came through, trembling, shattered. No longer cold the way it usually was. "Mom." 45 minutes after the call, the poor street on the south side suddenly sank into darkness. Glossy black SUVs rolled in nose to tail and packed the whole block. Vehicles worth many times more than Harlow's apartment. Men in black suits stepped out and formed a line like a wall of steel, their eyes sweeping every window, every corner, every stretch of pavement. Harlow's neighbors watched through cracked doors, whispering to one another in fear. The police never came to this neighborhood that fast, but this wasn't the police. This was something far more frightening than the police. The first vehicle's door opened. Ronan Whitaker stepped out. He wore his usual black suit, but today it was rumpled, as if he'd been in it for days without changing. His beard was unshaven. His eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. His sharp face, with the faint scar at his temple, looked more hollow than it ever had. Yet even at his worst, Ronan still carried a kind of power that made people lower their heads. He didn't speak. He walked straight into the old building and took the stairs 4 at a time. Dante and 2 others hurried after him, but Ronan was faster than all of them. He couldn't wait 1 more second. Harlow stood inside the apartment, her heart hammering as heavy footsteps hit the hallway. Then the door burst open. Ronan stood there, chest rising and falling from climbing too fast, his gaze sweeping the miserable little room before it locked onto the woman by the window, Vivian, his mother. Her head was still wrapped in bandages, her body thinner after days, but she was standing there, alive, breathing. "Mom." 1 word. Just one. But it held every sleepless night, every nightmare, every fear Ronan had kept caged for days. He stepped forward, then he ran, then he crashed into her and held her, the way a lost child holds home. After finally finding the way back, Vivian wrapped her arms around her son and stroked his hair, the way she had when he was small. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm safe now. I'm sorry I made you worry." And the impossible happened. Ronan Whitaker, the mafia boss Chicago feared, the man who had forgotten how to cry years ago, was crying. His tears soaked into his mother's shoulder. The first tears since the day his father fell into a pool of blood. Dante and the others stood outside the doorway, no one daring to step in. They had never seen Ronan like this. They hadn't even known he could cry. "I thought I'd lost you," Ronan said, his voice breaking. "Days." "Mom." "I turned Chicago upside down and I couldn't find you. I thought you had." He couldn't finish. He didn't dare say it. Vivian took his face in her hands and wiped his tears, the way she used to. "I'm here. I'm alive. Because of her." She turned her head toward Harlow, and only then did Ronan see her for the first time. She stood tucked into the corner, as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible, jeans torn at the knee, an old sweater worn thin at the shoulders, brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail, a narrow face with dark circles beneath sleepless eyes. She looked like she hadn't eaten a proper meal in years, but her back was straight, and when their eyes met, she didn't look down. She stared right at Ronan. No fear, no flinching. Ronan was used to people fearing him. Everyone feared him. But this girl, this thin young woman in this shabby apartment, didn't shake. He walked toward her, the instinctive suspicion that lived in his blood rising to the surface. "Who are you?" His voice turned cold again, sharp as a blade. Vivian started to speak, but Ronan went on. "Everyone wants something. Money, power, protection. What do you want? Say it. How much?" Harlow looked at the man in front of her. This was the mafia boss the newspapers wrote about. This was the man all of Chicago feared. This was Ronan Whitaker, but she had also just watched him cry in his mother's arms like a child. She took a deep breath. "I'm Harlow Sinclair, a nurse. I found Mrs. Vivian in an alley days ago. I brought her to the hospital. I took care of her when she had amnesia, and I don't want anything." Ronan gave a short, hard laugh. "No one is good for free." Harlow felt her heart hammering against her ribs, the sheer weight of his presence almost suffocating her. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, but her pride rose up like a shield to mask the terror. She wouldn't let him reduce her life's values to a business transaction. Harlow didn't move. "Then you haven't met enough decent people." That sentence stopped Ronan cold. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a threat to be measured, but as a person. Vivian stepped forward and took Harlow's hand. "She's telling the truth, Ronan. She used her last savings to pay for my hospital care. She went hungry so I could eat. She slept on the chair so I could have the bed. Days, my son, days she cared for a stranger and asked for nothing." Ronan didn't speak. He only nodded at Harlow, a small gesture, reluctant but no longer icy. Then he helped his mother to the door. Vivian turned back and hugged Harlow one last time. "We'll see each other again, I promise." The black convoy drove away, leaving Harlow standing alone in the empty room. She looked at the chair where Vivian had been sitting, looked at the bed where she had been lying, and the room felt colder than it ever had. In the SUV rolling back toward the North Shore, Ronan stared out the window, watching the old building fade behind them. "Who is she that Mom trusts her like that?" he asked Dante. Dante shook his head. "I don't know, boss, but she's different." Ronan didn't answer. He was asking himself the same thing. Days after Vivian left, Harlow's life began to change in strange ways she couldn't explain. That morning, she went to St. Mary's to visit Evelyn the way she always did. Her grandmother had been in the hospital for months with late-stage cancer. The medical bills piling up like a mountain, and Harlow had been picking up extra shifts just to pay it off $1 at a time. But when she stopped at the front desk to ask about this month's payment, the nurse on duty looked at her with open surprise. "Miss Sinclair, your grandmother's bill has been paid, all of it. $187,000. Harlow thought she'd misheard. "Who paid it?" The nurse shook her head. "Anonymous. They only asked that we not disclose the name." Harlow stood there, the world spinning. $187,000. Money she might not earn in a lifetime. Who could pay that for a stranger? but she already knew the answer. There was only one person. When Harlow got back to her apartment, she realized everything was different. The heater was running, the room warm for the first time in years. The windows had been replaced, no gaps left for wind to slip through. The refrigerator, when she opened it for a glass of water, was suddenly full of food. The kind of food she had never dared to buy because it cost too much. Fresh meat, vegetables, milk, eggs, fruit. And on the table, there was a black envelope. Harlow picked it up, her hands trembling. Inside were $20,000 in cash, stacked neatly in bundles, along with a black business card that held only one thing, an address. Whitaker Tower, 50th floor. Harlow sat down and stared at the money in front of her. $20,000, more than years of her wages. With that money, she could clear her debts. She could rest. She could buy Evelyn the best of everything. Part of her wanted to take it, to accept the gift, and keep living. But another part of her, the part her mother had taught her when she was little, the part Evelyn had nurtured for years, was shouting in her head. A debt of money can be repaid. A debt of kindness can last a lifetime. She hadn't saved Vivian for money. She'd saved her because it was the right thing to do. If she took this, her act would turn into a transaction, and Harlow Sinclair didn't sell her kindness. That afternoon, Harlow stood in front of Whitaker Tower and looked up at the stories of glass and steel. She walked into the lobby, the envelope gripped tight in her hand. The security guard looked her up and down, contempt plain on his face when he saw her worn clothes. "What do you need?" Harlow lifted her chin. "I need to see Mr. Ronan Whitaker." The guard gave a sharp, amused snort. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, then you can't go up." Harlow didn't flinch. "Tell him Harlow Sinclair is here to return his money." The guard started to refuse, but Dante appeared from somewhere nearby and gave a small nod. "Let her up." The elevator carried Harlow to the 50th floor. The doors opened and she stepped into a different world. Ronan's office was larger than her entire apartment. Glass walls overlooking all of Chicago, interiors of expensive oak and black leather. Ronan sat behind his desk, late afternoon sunlight catching the scar on his face. He watched her walk in, gray eyes giving nothing away. Harlow crossed the room and set the envelope on his desk. "I'm giving it back." Ronan frowned. "Why?" "I didn't save your mother for money," Harlow said, her voice calm but unyielding. "If I take this, it turns what I did into a transaction, and I don't want that." Ronan stood and came around the desk, stopping close. He was nearly a head taller than she was, his shadow falling over her like it meant to swallow her whole. But Harlow didn't step back. "This is my gratitude," Ronan said, his voice low and cold. "You saved my mother's life. You deserve to be repaid." Harlow shook her head. "You already paid my grandmother's bill, $187,000. That's more than enough. I don't need anything else." Ronan looked at her, as if she were something not quite human. In his years, no one had ever refused his money. No one. "You're foolish," he said. Harlow smiled, small and steady, not afraid at all. "Maybe, but I sleep at night." She turned and walked out of his office without waiting for his reaction. The door closed behind her. Ronan stood there, staring at the envelope on his desk, then at the door that had just shut. Dante stepped in and asked quietly, "Boss, what's wrong with her?" Ronan didn't answer. For the first time in years, someone had made him genuinely curious. A week after Harlow returned the $20,000 to Ronan, she was called into the manager's office at St. Mary's Hospital. The department head sat behind the desk, her face hard as money, not meeting Harlow's eyes as she spoke. "Miss Sinclair, in the past month, you've taken too many days off. We understand your situation, but the hospital can't continue like this. We have to let you go." Harlow felt as if someone had just punched her in the chest. "But I only took a few days to care for an emergency patient. I've worked here for years. I've never missed a shift, never been late." The department head sighed. "I know, Miss Sinclair, but the hospital is cutting staff. The budget is tight, and you have the least seniority in the department." Harlow understood. She understood very clearly. The hospital needed a reason to fire someone, and the days she'd taken off to care for Vivian were the perfect excuse. She was the easiest target. No powerful family, no connections, no one to protect her. Just a poor nurse no one would remember once she was gone. Harlow walked out of the hospital like a woman without a soul. Snow was falling, white flakes settling on the thin shoulders of her coat. But she didn't feel cold. She didn't feel anything. Her feet carried her without direction through familiar streets, until she realized she was sitting on a stone bench in the small park near her apartment. No one else was around, only her and the falling snow. Then everything hit her at once. No job meant no money. No money meant she couldn't pay rent. She couldn't buy Evelyn's medicine. She couldn't take care of the only family she had left. Harlow had tried. She had tried for years, since her mother died. She'd studied hard, worked without stopping, endured every hardship without a single complaint. She had done everything the right way, and life still wouldn't let her go. Tears began to fall. Harlow cried, the sound raw in the empty park. "Mom," she whispered to the gray sky. I tried as hard as I could. Why is it still not enough? Why won't life give me one chance?" A hand settled on her shoulder. Brielle, her closest co-worker at the hospital, had run after her and caught up without her even noticing. Brielle sat beside her, pulled Harlow into her arms, said nothing, simply held her while she cried, until she had no tears left. "It's going to be okay," Brielle said. "You'll find another job. You're the best nurse I know." Harlow wanted to believe that, but she knew reality was harsher than that. No one wanted to hire a nurse who'd just been fired. No one. At the same time, back at the Whitaker mansion, Vivian was calling Harlow the way she always did. She'd stayed in contact with the young woman all week, calling every day to check on her. But today, Harlow's voice was different, shaking thick with tears. And when Vivian asked what was wrong, Harlow went quiet for a long time before she finally admitted it. "I lost my job, Mrs. Vivian." Vivian felt her heart tighten. "Stay right there, I'll help." Harlow blurted, "No, I don't need pity. I'll figure it out myself." Vivian shook her head, even though Harlow couldn't see. "This isn't pity, Harlow. This is family." She set the phone down and went straight to Ronan's office. He was reading reports, but he looked up when he saw his mother enter with a serious expression. "The girl who saved my life just lost her job," Vivian said plainly. Ronan frowned. "And, give her a job. Whitaker Medical Center needs nurses." Ronan set the report down and looked at his mother. "You want me to hire a stranger into my empire? You know how dangerous that is." Vivian stepped closer and held his gaze. "She isn't a stranger. She's our benefactor. She saved my life, took care of me for days, then refused the $20,000 you offered. In your entire life, how many people like that have you met?" Ronan fell silent. The answer was none. Not once. "You owe her." "Ronan," Vivian said, her voice gentle but firm. "And my son. This is your chance to pay that debt." The next day, Dante appeared at Harlow's apartment door with an envelope. Inside was a job offer from Whitaker Medical Center, the most luxurious private hospital in Chicago, one of the Whitaker family's legal businesses. The salary was double her old pay, night shift nursing position. Along with it was a handwritten note from Vivian. "This isn't charity. This is an opportunity you deserve. If you're good, you keep the job. If you aren't, you get fired like anyone else. Prove I was right to trust you." Harlow held the letter in her hands, and tears fell again. But this time, they were tears of hope. She looked at Dante and nodded. "Tell Mrs. Vivian I won't disappoint her. She didn't know that when she walked through the doors of Whitaker Medical Center, She was stepping into Ronan's world, and that world was going to change her forever. Weeks had passed since the day Harlow first walked into Whitaker Medical Center. This hospital was nothing like St. Mary's, the place she'd worked for years. Everything here was modern and lavish, from the marble-tiled corridors to the most expensive medical equipment she'd never even been allowed to touch before. The patients here were Chicago's upper class, people who could pay tens of thousands of dollars for a single night in a hospital bed without a second thought. And her coworkers. They looked at her with suspicion from the very first day. She got in here through connections. They whispered behind her back. There's definitely something between her and the Whitaker family. Harlow heard every word and said nothing. She kept her head down and worked harder than anyone else, proving she deserved to be here, and she proved it. After weeks, no one could deny Harlow's ability. She moved fast and sure, precise, always willing to take an extra shift when someone else needed time off. She treated every patient the same, from wealthy businessmen to the housekeepers their employers brought in for checkups. Slowly, her co-workers' suspicious looks shifted into reluctant respect. But Harlow didn't care about that. She still lived in her old apartment on the south side, still saved every dollar, still took the bus to work every day. Her pay was higher, but she poured it into Evelyn's care. Vivian came to the hospital often, under the excuse of routine checkups, but really it was to see Harlow. They ate lunch together in the staff cafeteria, talking like mother and daughter. Vivian told her about Ronan, about the boy who used to laugh, about how he changed after his father died. "My son wasn't born cold," she said, her eyes distant with sadness. "When he was little, he laughed all the time. He loved reading, loved drawing, loved running through the garden chasing butterflies. Then his father died, and my son's smile died with him." Harlow listened without speaking, but she began to understand more about the man all of Chicago feared. One afternoon, Ronan came to the hospital to sign papers. As he passed the third-floor corridor, he heard a familiar voice drifting out from the nurse's station. He stopped, stood behind the corner, and listened. Harlow was on the phone. Her voice bright and warm. "Grandma, I'm okay. The new job is really good. Everyone's friendly. Don't worry about me. All right, just rest and take your medicine, and I'll come see you this weekend." She laughed, a soft laugh like spring wind. "No, I'm not lacking anything. I've got enough money. You don't have to worry." Ronan looked through the gap in the doorway. He watched Harlow hang up, and the smile on her mouth vanished at once. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying before she made the call. He saw her sit down, cover her face with both hands, her shoulders trembling. Then she drew a long breath, wiped her tears, stood up, and walked out with a calm expression as if nothing had happened. He knew what had happened earlier. A difficult patient had just cursed her out because she'd arrived minutes late. And he'd also heard other nurses talking about her behind her back. Yet, she still told her grandmother, "I'm okay." She lied so Evelyn wouldn't worry. She swallowed her tears so the only family she had could feel at peace. Ronan stood there for a long time, watching her thin figure disappear at the end of the corridor. For the first time, he saw quiet sacrifice. For the first time, he understood why his mother trusted this girl so deeply. That night, the sky opened, rain pouring down in sheets. Harlow finished her shift at 11, stepped out into the parking lot, and realized she didn't have an umbrella. She stood under the awning, staring at the white wall of rain, calculating whether she should run to the bus stop meters away. Then a black SUV pulled up right in front of her. The window rolled down. Ronan sat inside, looking at her with unreadable gray eyes. "Get in. I'll drive you home." Harlow shook her head. "No need. I can take the bus." Ronan frowned. "The last bus left minutes ago. Don't be stubborn." Harlow hesitated, then opened the door and climbed in. The car was warm and smelled of expensive leather. They rode in silence as the vehicle moved through slick, rain-washed streets. Ronan didn't speak, eyes fixed ahead. Harlow didn't speak either, hands resting in her lap, tense. Then Ronan broke the silence. "You're doing well. Management told me." Harlow turned to him. "I work for my patients, not for your praise." Ronan gave the smallest hint of a smile, one corner of his mouth lifting, and it was the first time Harlow had ever seen him smile. "Are you always this stubborn?" Harlow smiled too, "Only when I have to be." The car stopped at a red light. They turned and looked at each other, and in that moment, something shifted. Then they both looked away, as if afraid of what they might see in the other's eyes. When the SUV stopped in front of Harlow's apartment, she opened the door, stepped out, then turned back. "Thank you for the ride." Ronan nodded, said nothing. Harlow went inside, and when she turned on the light, she looked out through the window. The black SUV was still parked there under the rain, as if it were waiting for something. Her heart jumped just once. "Why am I like this?" she asked herself. Inside the car, Ronan still sat there, watching the light come on in her window. For the first time in years, there was someone he didn't want to leave. Weeks after that rainy night, Ronan Whitaker sat in his dark office, a whiskey glass in his hand, long since empty, and he couldn't be bothered to pour another. He was thinking about the brown-haired girl with eyes that didn't know fear. He thought about her smile in the car that night, about the way she'd said, "Only when I have to," with that stubborn, almost sweet defiance. He was thinking about her more than he should, and it made him angry. Ronan Whitaker wasn't allowed to have feelings. Feelings were weakness. Weakness got used by enemies. Years ago, he'd learned that lesson when his father fell into a pool of blood. He couldn't make the same mistake. He needed a reason to push her away. He needed to find something ugly about her, anything at all, to prove she was like everyone else, just trying to use him. Ronan summoned Dante to his office. "Investigate Harlow Sinclair," he said, his voice cold as ice. "Everything, her family, her relationships, her finances. Find out what she really wants." Dante looked at him surprised. "Boss, is there something wrong with her? I thought she'd already been vetted." Ronan ground his teeth. "No one is good without conditions. Find her real motive. That's an order." Days later, Dante returned with a thick report. Harlow Sinclair, a young woman, lost her mother at a young age in a car accident. Father left when she was small. Whereabouts unknown. Raised by her grandmother, Evelyn, graduated top of her nursing program. Worked at St. Mary's Hospital for years. No criminal record, no debt except her grandmother's hospital bills, which you paid, no ties to any organization. Dante set the report on the desk and looked Ronan straight in the eye. "She's clean, boss. Cleaner than anyone I've ever investigated. She really is just a poor nurse with a heart that's too big." Ronan was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Keep watching." In the days that followed, Harlow began to notice something was off. The familiar black car appeared on the corner every time she left home. Strangers came by asking her neighbors about her routines, about the people she met. The old woman across the hall told her someone had come by to ask whether Harlow ever brought strange men home. Harlow understood immediately. She knew exactly who was behind it. That afternoon, Harlow didn't go to the hospital. She went straight to Whitaker Tower, crossed the lobby without waiting for anyone to escort her, rode the elevator to the 50th floor. When she stormed into Ronan's office, he was sitting behind his desk, not looking surprised at all to see her. "You've got people following me," Harlow said, her voice shaking with anger, though she tried to hold it down. Ronan didn't deny it. He stood, came around the desk, and faced her. "I need to know who you are." Harlow laughed, bitter. "I already told you. I'm a nurse. I saved your mother. What else do you want?" Ronan stepped closer, crowding her, his shadow falling over her like it wanted to swallow her whole. "I want to know what you really want. No one is kind without a motive. What are you waiting for? Money? Power? Or are you working for someone?" Harlow didn't step back. Even though her heart was pounding hard enough to break ribs, She held his gaze. Those cold, gray eyes she'd seen warm on that rainy night. "Do you know what your problem is, Ronan Whitaker?" she asked, her voice ringing through the quiet room. "You've lived in the dark so long you forgot light exists. You think everyone is like you, everyone calculating, everyone using people, but not everyone is. There are people who do good only because it's the right thing. But you can't believe that, can you? Because if you do, you'll have to admit you've been living the wrong way for years." Her eyes were red, but she didn't cry. She wouldn't let him see her weak. "I don't want anything from you," she said, her voice thick. "I just want you to leave me alone." She turned and walked out of the office. And this time, she didn't look back. The next day, Harlow submitted her resignation at Whitaker Medical Center. She didn't explain why, only said she'd found another job. But Vivian knew the truth. She called Harlow and heard the young woman's voice shaking as she said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vivian. I can't work somewhere I'm suspected every second. I tried, but I can't keep doing this." Vivian went to see Ronan that same afternoon. She walked into her son's office, her eyes blazing with anger. "What did you do to her? Ronan wouldn't look at his mother. I was protecting the family." Vivian slammed her hand down on the desk, making Ronan flinch. "By hurting the person who saved my life. You know she's good. You know it. But you're afraid. You're afraid to open your heart to anyone. You're afraid of getting hurt the way you were hurt when your father died." She stepped closer, took her son's face in her hands, forced him to look at her. "Years, Ronan, since your father died. You've locked yourself in the dark. You don't let anyone close. And now, when there's finally a girl, a good and innocent girl, you push her away." Tears slid down Vivian's cheeks. "You're not a monster, Ronan, I know that. But if you keep living like this, you'll become one for real." Vivian left, and Ronan was alone in the dark office again. He sat there, staring into nothing. And for the first time in his life, he saw himself through someone else's eyes. He saw a man who was lonely and cold, pushing away everyone who cared. He saw a young boy who was still afraid, still running, still building walls so high no one could touch his heart, and he hated what he saw. Days had passed since the argument in that 50th floor office. Harlow had gone back to work at St. Mary's, the same hospital that had fired her before. They took her back at lower pay and with worse shifts, but she didn't care. At least here, no one followed her. No one suspected her. No one looked at her like she was a con artist waiting for her moment to strike. She worked, went home, visited Evelyn, then went back to work. Life slid back into the shape it had before she ever found Vivian Hawthorne in a dark alley, as if everything had been nothing but a dream. But every night, Harlow still thought about him, about those cold gray eyes that had once been warm on a rainy night, about the rare smile that had touched his mouth when she said, "Only when I have to," about the way he cried when he held his mother like a lost child who'd finally found the road home. She was angry that he hadn't trusted her, but she was also sad. Sad for a man who'd lived inside suspicion for years, unable to believe anyone, unable to open his heart to anyone. On the 5th night, rain came down again. Harlow finished her shift at 10, stepped out of St. Mary's, and stood under the awning, waiting for the rain to ease. She didn't have an umbrella, as usual. She was calculating whether she should run for the bus stop when she saw a figure standing across the street. Through the white curtain of rain, she recognized him immediately. Ronan Whitaker stood there alone. No umbrella, no car, no entourage. His black coat was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead, but he stayed right there, looking at her. Harlow meant to turn away, but her legs didn't listen. She stepped out from under the awning, crossed the street, and stopped in front of him. Rain hit her shoulders, bitter cold, but she didn't care. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice colder than the rain. Ronan looked at her, and Harlow saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not coldness, not suspicion, pain, and fear. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough from standing too long in the freezing rain. Harlow didn't speak. She only stood there and watched him. Ronan went on, word by word, as if he were learning how to speak again from the beginning. "I was wrong. I suspected you without reason. I had people follow you. I hurt you, and I'm sorry." Harlow gave a bitter little laugh. "Then why? You said it yourself. You needed to know who I was. You investigated me. You know everything about me. So why didn't you trust me?" Ronan fell silent for a long time. Rain kept falling, soaking them both, but neither of them moved. Then he spoke, so quietly, Harlow had to lean in to catch it. "I was afraid." Harlow frowned. "Afraid of what? I'm just a poor nurse." "I don't have anything you should be afraid of." Ronan lifted his head and looked straight into her eyes, and for the first time, she saw him truly as himself. No mask, no walls, just a man trembling in the cold rain. "I'm afraid of you, Harlow. Afraid of what you make me feel." Harlow stood there, her heart skipping a beat. Ronan kept going, as if once he'd opened his mouth, he couldn't stop. "Years since my father died. I haven't allowed myself to be weak. Feelings are weakness. Anyone who matters to me becomes a target for my enemies. I lost my father because of that. I almost lost my mother because of that. I didn't want to drag you into my dangerous world. I thought if I found something ugly about you, I'd have a reason to push you away. But you're clean. You're pure. You're better than anyone I've ever met, and that scares me more." Harlow didn't know what to say. She looked at the man in front of her, the mafia boss all of Chicago feared, standing drenched in rain, apologizing like a boy who'd done wrong. She let out a breath, then did something that surprised even her. She took the knit cap off her own head and put it on his. It looked ridiculous, a cheap knit cap on the head of a billionaire, but at least it shielded him from the rain. "Come inside," she said. "You're going to catch a cold." Ronan stared at her, his eyes widening slightly. "You forgive me?" Harlow shook her head. "I don't know. I need time." She looked at him, and her voice softened just slightly. "But I don't hate you anymore." Ronan looked at her, and for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe. "That's a start," he said. They stood there a little longer in the rain and the dim glow of the streetlights. Two people from two different worlds, both soaked through, both shivering, and neither of them wanting to be the first to walk away. Weeks after that rainy night, things began to shift slowly, almost quietly. Harlow returned to Whitaker Medical Center at Ronan's request, and this time, no one followed her anymore. They saw each other more often, sometimes at the hospital, sometimes over lunches with Vivian. Their relationship was still cautious, like two people learning how to trust from the beginning, but something between them was warming little by little. Ronan stayed cold to the outside world, but when he was with Harlow, he allowed himself to smile. And Harlow, she was learning how to see light inside his darkness. That night, Harlow was having dinner with Ronan and Vivian in the mansion's grand dining room. They were laughing over a story from Ronan's childhood Vivian was telling, about the young boy who once hid in a closet all day because he was terrified of going to the dentist. Ronan looked at his mother with mock embarrassment, and Harlow laughed until tears ran down her face. It was one of those rare moments when she felt peaceful, when she felt like she belonged here. Then her phone rang. St. Mary's Hospital. Harlow answered, and her world collapsed in an instant. "Miss Sinclair, your grandmother, Evelyn, her condition has suddenly worsened. The tumor has spread to her heart. She needs surgery immediately." Harlow felt as if all the air had been pulled out of her lungs. "The chances of success?" she asked, her voice shaking. There was a pause on the other end. Then the doctor said, 30%, ma'am. Her heart is very weak. We'll do everything we can, but you should prepare yourself. The phone slipped from Harlow's hand and hit the floor with a dull crack. She stood there, eyes wide, seeing nothing. Evelyn, the only person who had been beside her for years, the woman who raised her, who wiped her tears every time she cried for her mother, who worked herself to exhaustion so Harlow could afford school. Evelyn, the person Harlow loved more than her own life. "My grandma," Harlow whispered, her voice breaking like glass. "My grandma." Ronan stood up immediately. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to, because he saw it all in her eyes. He took her hand, his voice low and steady. "Come on, I'm taking you there now." They got into the car, and Ronan drove like a man possessed through the night city, running red lights, flying down empty streets. Harlow sat beside him, shaking, tears spilling without stopping. She prayed to anyone who might be listening. "Please don't take her from me. Please give me more time." When they reached St. Mary's, Evelyn had already been taken into emergency care. Harlow ran to the window and saw her grandmother lying there, small and fragile, an oxygen mask covering half her face, wires and machines all around. Harlow dropped to her knees by the bed and gripped Evelyn's wrinkled hand. "Grandma, don't leave me." Evelyn opened her eyes, weak, but she still tried to smile when she saw her granddaughter. "My girl, don't cry. I'm old now." Harlow shook her head, tears dripping onto Evelyn's hand. "No, you promised me. You promised you'd stay with me. You promised you'd see me in a wedding dress. You promised." Ronan stood in the hallway, watching through the glass, and his chest tightened as if someone were crushing his heart in a fist. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, one after another. "Find me the best cardiac surgeon in the United States. I don't care where they are. New York, Los Angeles, or hell. Get them to Chicago tonight." Money is no limit. Over the next hours, top specialists were brought in on a private jet. Dr. Elias Hart, the most famous cardiac surgeon on the East Coast, came in person to perform the operation. Evelyn was taken into surgery. The doors shut, and Harlow collapsed into a chair in the hallway, as if her legs no longer had strength to hold her up. Ronan sat down beside her. He didn't speak. He just stayed. They sat like that for hours, watching the wall clock bleed away minute by minute. Harlow cried until there were no tears left, and then she only sat there, hands clenched together, praying in silence. "She's everything to me," Harlow whispered into the emptiness. "If she goes, I'll have no one left in this world." Ronan turned to her, and he did something he had never done with anyone. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, letting her cry into his shoulder. "You still have me," he said, his voice low and gentle. "If you want." Harlow lifted her face and stared at him through tears. "What did you just say?" Ronan didn't answer with words. He looked into her red-rimmed eyes, and for the first time, he began to tell her something he'd never told anyone but his mother. "When I was young, I watched my father die in front of me. He was on the floor, blood everywhere, and I couldn't do anything. I just stood there and watched him go." His voice caught. "Since that day, I've been afraid of losing the people I love, afraid of caring about someone and then watching them get taken away. So I locked my heart. I didn't let anyone close. I thought that would make me safe." He looked at her, his gray eyes glinting under the hospital lights. "But then I met you, and I realized I don't want safe anymore." Harlow stayed silent, tears rising again. Ronan lifted his hand and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "I don't know what love is, Harlow. I don't know how to care about someone the right way. I've lived in the dark too long." He looked at her, more sincere than she'd ever seen him. "But with you, I want to learn, if you'll give me the chance." Harlow couldn't speak. She only squeezed his hand tighter, and they sat there in the quiet hospital corridor and waited. Between fear and hope, between darkness and light, two wounded hearts found each other. Hours. Hours that felt like an entire lifetime. Harlow and Ronan sat on the row of chairs outside the operating room, neither of them speaking a single word. Vivian had arrived at midnight, sitting beside them, holding Harlow's hand to lend her strength. The clock on the wall ticked off each second, and with every second that passed, Harlow felt herself dying little by little. She had prayed every prayer she knew. She had made promises to God, to her mother in heaven, to anyone who might be listening, that she would do anything if they let Evelyn live. Anything. Then the operating room doors opened. Dr. Elias Hart stepped out, pulled off his mask, his face exhausted, but his eyes holding a glimmer of something. Harlow sprang to her feet, her heart stopping. She couldn't finish the question. Dr. Hart smiled, the first smile Harlow had seen all night. The surgery was successful. She needs time to recover, but she's going to live. Harlow didn't hear anything after that. The world around her dissolved, leaving only 4 words echoing in her head. She's going to live. She's going to live. Her knees gave out, and she broke down, sobbing. Not the jagged grief she'd been carrying all night, but the sobs of relief, of fierce joy, of someone pulled back from the edge of despair. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, she turned to Ronan and threw her arms around him. It was the first time she had reached for him first. Ronan stood there, his body going rigid with surprise. He wasn't used to being held. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had hugged him except his mother. But then slowly, he put his arms around her and held on tight. He felt her shaking against him, felt her tears soaking through his shirt, and he realized he was crying too, the second tear in years. "Thank you," Harlow whispered into his shoulder. "Thank you. Thank you for saving her." Vivian stood beside them, watching the 2 young people holding each other, and she smiled, the smile of a mother watching her son finally find happiness. Days later, Evelyn woke up. Harlow had sat by her bed the entire time, never leaving for even a moment. When Evelyn opened her eyes and saw her granddaughter, she tried to smile. "My girl, why do you look so awful? Have you not slept for days?" Harlow laughed through tears. "If you still have enough strength to tease me, you're doing fine." Evelyn took Harlow's hand, weak but warm. "I'm not going anywhere. I still have to see you in a wedding dress." Then Evelyn noticed Ronan standing in the corner of the room, silent as a shadow. She narrowed her eyes at him, and Harlow suddenly felt her heart thump harder. Evelyn knew who Ronan Whitaker was. Everyone in Chicago did. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice weak but still sharp. Harlow hurried. "Grandma, this is Ronan, my friend." Evelyn looked Ronan up and down, then looked at Harlow, then back at Ronan. "You're Ronan Whitaker. I know you. People talk about you, not in a good way." Ronan stepped closer to the bed, not avoiding the old woman's piercing gaze. "They're not wrong," he said honestly. "I'm not a good man." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, studying him as if she were reading every thought inside his head. Then she spoke, her voice softer. "How long have you been here?" Ronan didn't understand the question. "Ma'am!" Evelyn pointed at the chair by the bed where a blanket was neatly folded and a pillow lay waiting. "The nurse told me a man has been sitting here for days, not leaving, taking care of my granddaughter when she fell asleep from exhaustion." She turned to Harlow. "Was that you?" Ronan didn't answer, but his silence was the answer. Evelyn watched him, then watched the way he watched Harlow, the way his eyes softened when her granddaughter smiled, the way he moved closer without thinking when Harlow coughed from days without sleep. "You look at my granddaughter like she's your whole world," Evelyn said, her voice catching. Ronan looked startled. "How do I look at her?" Evelyn smiled, the smile of someone who had lived long enough to see through people. "The way my husband looked at me once. Like if you lose her, you'll lose your whole world." Evelyn reached for Ronan's hand, her wrinkled palm warm around his. "Good or bad, I don't know, and I don't care what people say about you. I only know one thing. You love my girl for real, and that's enough for me." That night, after Evelyn had fallen asleep again and Vivian had gone back to the mansion to rest, Harlow and Ronan sat on a bench in the hospital corridor. The lights were dim, the air quiet, except for the soft beeps drifting from patient rooms. Harlow leaned her head against Ronan's shoulder, exhausted but calm. "Thank you," she said, for what felt like the 100th time in days, for everything. Ronan looked down at her. "Don't thank me. I did it because I wanted to." Harlow lifted her face and looked into his eyes. "You said you want to learn how to love. Did you mean it?" Ronan didn't answer with words. He looked into her red-rimmed eyes, and for the first time, he began to tell her something he'd never told anyone but his mother. "When I was young, I watched my father die in front of me. He was on the floor, blood everywhere, and I couldn't do anything. I just stood there and watched him go." His voice caught. "Since that day, I've been afraid of losing the people I love, afraid of caring about someone and then watching them get taken away. So I locked my heart. I didn't let anyone close. I thought that would make me safe." He looked at her, his gray eyes glinting under the hospital lights. "But then I met you, and I realized I don't want safe anymore." Harlow stayed silent, tears rising again. Ronan lifted his hand and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "I don't know what love is, Harlow. I don't know how to care about someone the right way. I've lived in the dark too long." He looked at her, more sincere than she'd ever seen him. "But with you, I want to learn, if you'll give me the chance." Harlow couldn't speak. She only squeezed his hand tighter, and they sat there in the quiet hospital corridor and waited. Between fear and hope, between darkness and light, two wounded hearts found each other. Hours. Hours that felt like an entire lifetime. Harlow and Ronan sat on the row of chairs outside the operating room, neither of them speaking a single word. Vivian had arrived at midnight, sitting beside them, holding Harlow's hand to lend her strength. The clock on the wall ticked off each second, and with every second that passed, Harlow felt herself dying little by little. She had prayed every prayer she knew. She had made promises to God, to her mother in heaven, to anyone who might be listening, that she would do anything if they let Evelyn live. Anything. Then the operating room doors opened. Dr. Elias Hart stepped out, pulled off his mask, his face exhausted, but his eyes holding a glimmer of something. Harlow sprang to her feet, her heart stopping. She couldn't finish the question. Dr. Hart smiled, the first smile Harlow had seen all night. The surgery was successful. She needs time to recover, but she's going to live. Harlow didn't hear anything after that. The world around her dissolved, leaving only 4 words echoing in her head. She's going to live. She's going to live. Her knees gave out, and she broke down, sobbing. Not the jagged grief she'd been carrying all night, but the sobs of relief, of fierce joy, of someone pulled back from the edge of despair. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, she turned to Ronan and threw her arms around him. It was the first time she had reached for him first. Ronan stood there, his body going rigid with surprise. He wasn't used to being held. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had hugged him except his mother. But then, slowly, he put his arms around her and held on tight. He felt her shaking against him, felt her tears soaking through his shirt, and he realized he was crying too, the second tear in years. "Thank you," Harlow whispered into his shoulder. Thank you for saving her." Vivian stood beside them, watching the 2 young people holding each other, and she smiled, the smile of a mother watching her son finally find happiness. Days after that fateful night, Evelyn woke up. Harlow had sat by her bed the entire time, never leaving for even a moment. When Evelyn opened her eyes and saw her granddaughter, she tried to smile. "My girl, why do you look so awful? Have you not slept for days?" Harlow laughed through tears. "If you still have enough strength to tease me, you're doing fine." Evelyn took Harlow's hand, weak but warm. "I'm not going anywhere. I still have to see you in a wedding dress." Then Evelyn noticed Ronan standing in the corner of the room, silent as a shadow. She narrowed her eyes at him, and Harlow suddenly felt her heart thump harder. Evelyn knew who Ronan Whitaker was. Everyone in Chicago did. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice weak but still sharp. Harlow hurried. "Grandma, this is Ronan, my friend." Evelyn looked Ronan up and down, then looked at Harlow, then back at Ronan. "You're Ronan Whitaker. I know you. People talk about you, not in a good way." Ronan stepped closer to the bed, not avoiding the old woman's piercing gaze. "They're not wrong," he said honestly. "I'm not a good man." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, studying him as if she were reading every thought inside his head. Then she spoke, her voice softer. "How long have you been here?" Ronan didn't understand the question. "Ma'am." Evelyn pointed at the chair by the bed where a blanket was neatly folded and a pillow lay waiting. "The nurse told me a man has been sitting here for days, not leaving, taking care of my granddaughter when she fell asleep from exhaustion." She turned to Harlow. "Was that you?" Ronan didn't answer, but his silence was the answer. Evelyn watched him, then watched the way he watched Harlow, the way his eyes softened when her granddaughter smiled, the way he moved closer without thinking when Harlow coughed from days without sleep. "You look at my granddaughter like she's your whole world," Evelyn said, her voice catching. Ronan looked startled. "How do I look at her?" Evelyn smiled, the smile of someone who had lived long enough to see through people. "The way my husband looked at me once, like, if you lose her, you'll lose your whole world." Evelyn reached for Ronan's hand, her wrinkled palm warm around his. "Good or bad, I don't know. And I don't care what people say about you. I only know one thing. You love my girl for real, and that's enough for me." That night, after Evelyn had fallen asleep again and Vivian had gone back to the mansion to rest, Harlow and Ronan sat on a bench in the hospital corridor. The lights were dim, the air quiet, except for the soft beeps drifting from patient rooms. Harlow leaned her head against Ronan's shoulder, exhausted but calm. "Thank you," she said, for what felt like the 100th time in days, for everything. Ronan looked down at her. "Don't thank me. I did it because I wanted to." Harlow lifted her face and looked into his eyes. "You said you want to learn how to love. Did you mean it?" Ronan didn't answer with words. He looked into her red-rimmed eyes, and for the first time, he began to tell her something he'd never told anyone but his mother. "When I was young, I watched my father die in front of me. He was on the floor, blood everywhere, and I couldn't do anything. I just stood there and watched him go." His voice caught. "Since that day, I've been afraid of losing the people I love, afraid of caring about someone and then watching them get taken away. So I locked my heart. I didn't let anyone close. I thought that would make me safe." He looked at her, his gray eyes glinting under the hospital lights. "But then I met you, and I realized I don't want safe anymore." Harlow stayed silent, tears rising again. Ronan lifted his hand and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "I don't know what love is. Harlow, I don't know how to care about someone the right way. I've lived in the dark too long." He looked at her, more sincere than she'd ever seen him. "But with you, I want to learn, if you'll give me the chance." Harlow couldn't speak. She only squeezed his hand tighter, and they sat there in the quiet hospital corridor and waited. Between fear and hope, between darkness and light, two wounded hearts found each other. Hours. Hours that felt like an entire lifetime. Harlow and Ronan sat on the row of chairs outside the operating room, neither of them speaking a single word. Vivian had arrived at midnight, sitting beside them, holding Harlow's hand to lend her strength. The clock on the wall ticked off each second, and with every second that passed, Harlow felt herself dying little by little. She had prayed every prayer she knew. She had made promises to God, to her mother in heaven, to anyone who might be listening, that she would do anything if they let Evelyn live. Anything. Then the operating room doors opened. Dr. Elias Hart stepped out, pulled off his mask, his face exhausted, but his eyes holding a glimmer of something. Surgery was successful. She needs time to surgery was successful. She needs time to recover, but she's going to live. Harlow didn't hear anything after that. The world around her dissolved, leaving only 4 words echoing in her head. She's going to live. She's going to live. Her knees gave out, and she broke down, sobbing. Not the jagged grief she'd been carrying all night, but the sobs of relief, of fierce joy, of someone pulled back from the edge of despair. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, she turned to Ronan and threw her arms around him. It was the first time she had reached for him first. Ronan stood there, his body going rigid with surprise. He wasn't used to being held. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had hugged him except his mother. But then slowly, he put his arms around her and held on tight. He felt her shaking against him, felt her tears soaking through his shirt, and he realized he was crying too, the second tear in years. "Thank you," Harlow whispered into his shoulder. "Thank you. Thank you for saving her." Vivian stood beside them, watching the 2 young people holding each other, and she smiled, the smile of a mother watching her son finally find happiness. Weeks had passed since the horrifying night at Pier 47. Harlow lay in the intensive care unit at Whitaker Medical Center, where the best doctors had been summoned by Ronan to care for her. The bullet had torn through her left shoulder, missing a major artery by a breath. She had lost a great deal of blood. And in the first days, the doctors couldn't say whether she would make it. But Harlow was strong. She fought. And in the end, she won. Ronan didn't leave her side for that entire time. He slept in the chair beside her bed, ate whatever he could without thinking, refused every meeting and every piece of work. When Harlow opened her eyes for the first time after days of coma, the first thing she saw was him, and she almost didn't recognize him. Ronan Whitaker, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, sat there looking nothing like the man she knew. His beard hadn't been shaved, rough on his jaw and cheeks. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and from crying. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair a mess. For the first time, she saw him as ordinary as a man terrified because he had almost lost the woman he loved. "You look like you're homeless," Harlow said, her voice from days of not using it. Ronan looked at her, and tears spilled over. He didn't try to hide them, didn't try to act strong the way he always had. He only took her hand, lifted it, and kissed her knuckles. "You almost left me," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't ever do that again. I can't live without you." Harlow tried to smile, even though every movement sent pain through her shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Vivian and Evelyn came to visit every day. The 2 older women had become close during Harlow's hospital stay, sitting side by side, holding hands, praying together for the young woman. Evelyn cried when she saw her granddaughter wake. She hugged Harlow, even though Harlow was hurting, and she kept saying she was sorry, that it was all her fault. Harlow shook her head and told her she would do it 1,000 times over if she had to, because Evelyn was everything to her. Weeks after Harlow woke up, Dante Rossi's funeral was held. It was a solemn service with hundreds in attendance. From Ronan's people to ordinary citizens Dante had helped throughout his life. Harlow was brought in a wheelchair, her shoulder still wrapped, but she insisted on being there. Dante had died because of her. She had to be there to say goodbye. Ronan stood before the coffin and delivered the eulogy. His voice was low and thick, but he didn't cry. He had cried enough in the long nights beside Harlow's bed. "Dante Rossi," he began, looking down at the coffin covered in white flowers, "wasn't just my right-hand man. He was family. The brother I never had, the only friend I've truly trusted in the past years." He stopped and drew a deep breath. "He died protecting the person I love. He didn't hesitate, didn't think. He just moved and used his own body to shield her. That was Dante, always putting others before himself." Ronan looked down at Harlow in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she sat in the wheelchair. "I don't deserve that sacrifice, but I'm going to try. I'm going to live in a way that honors his death. I promise." After the funeral, Ronan brought Harlow back to the Whitaker mansion to rest. They sat in the living room by the fire, Vivian and Evelyn, long since asleep. Ronan held Harlow's hand, stared into the flames, and said something she didn't expect. "I'm going to change," he said, his voice low and serious. "I'm going to transition into legitimate business. No more violence, no more blood, no more nights where I have to torture enemies in the outbuilding." Harlow looked at him startled. "You mean it?" Ronan nodded. "Dante died because of me, because of the life I chose. I don't want anyone else to die, and I don't want you to live in fear for the rest of your life." He turned to her, gray eyes catching the firelight. "My mother has prayed for this for years now. I'm going to do it for her, for Dante, and for you." Harlow didn't speak. She only leaned in and rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat there in silence. Outside, snow began to fall, laying white over the garden where she had once seen his darkness. But now she wasn't afraid. She knew he was changing, and she would stay beside him through all of it. Russo had been turned over to the police, along with all the evidence of Ronan's father's murder years earlier. He would never see freedom again, and the scar on Harlow's shoulder would stay forever, a reminder of the price of love, of sacrifice, of the night she almost lost everything. And yet, in the end, found everything. Months had passed since the horrifying night at Pier 47. Winter was gone. Spring had arrived, and life had changed in ways no one could have imagined. The Whitaker mansion was no longer cold and shadowed the way it used to be. Laughter filled it every day. Lively conversation spilled through the living room, and the smell of good food drifted out of the kitchen. Evelyn had moved in to live with Vivian, at Vivian's invitation. At first, Evelyn refused, saying she was used to living simply and didn't belong in a lavish mansion. But Vivian only smiled and said, "Then we'll live simply in a mansion." And so, the two older women became kindred spirits. They cooked together, tended the flower garden together, watched films together, and told each other stories from the past. Vivian spoke of Harlan, of her love for the man she had lost years earlier. Evelyn spoke of Lila, the daughter she had lost, and the granddaughter she had raised with every ounce of love she had. They understood each other because they were both mothers who had lived through loss and pain. Harlow wasn't a nurse anymore. She had become the director of the Whitaker Foundation, the charity Ronan founded to help the poor, orphaned children, and patients who couldn't afford treatment. She loved the work because it let her keep helping people the way she always had, only on a much larger scale. Every day she went to the office, reviewed applications for aid, met with struggling families, and watched the smiles bloom on their faces when help finally reached them. The scar on her shoulder was still there. Sometimes it still ached when the weather turned cold, but she never hid it. It was a reminder of the night she almost lost everything, and also proof that she survived and was stronger than ever. Ronan kept his promise. He gradually shifted the Whitaker empire into legitimate business. Shut down the darker operations, expanded legal companies and hospitals. No more nights of torturing enemies in the outbuilding, no more gunshots and blood. He was still the most powerful man in Chicago. But now that power came from respect instead of fear. Russo was rotting in prison and would never get out. And every night when Ronan came home, He was greeted by Harlow's smile, by his mother's laughter, and Evelyn's laughter in the living room. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a real family. One night in June, Ronan took Harlow for a walk in the city. She didn't know where he was taking her, only that he seemed secretive and unusually nervous. Then the car stopped, and Harlow recognized the place, the dark alley on the south side, the place where she found Vivian months earlier, the place where everything began. But the alley was different now. It had been cleaned, lit by hundreds of flickering candles. White roses were scattered everywhere, and at the end of the alley, Ronan dropped to one knee, a red velvet box in his hand. "This place changed my life. Harlow," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You changed me. You pulled me out of the darkness. You taught me what love is. You gave me a reason to live, to become a better man." He opened the box. Inside, a diamond ring glittered under the candlelight. "Harlow Sinclair, will you stay with me for the rest of my life?" Harlow cried. She cried from happiness, from not being able to believe her life had changed so much in months. She nodded, said yes 1,000 times, and Ronan slid the ring onto her finger, then held her tight in the very alley that had witnessed their beginning. The wedding was held a month later, simple and intimate, just as Harlow wanted. No show, no extravagance, only family and the people they loved most. Evelyn walked Harlow down the aisle. Instead of the father she had never had, she cried through the entire ceremony. But they were tears of joy. Vivian sat in the front row, holding Evelyn's hand, two mothers watching their children find happiness. And Ronan, the man who hadn't smiled in years, was smiling now, radiant, as he watched his bride walk toward him. That night, Harlow stood by the bedroom window, looking out at the garden, bathed in moonlight. Ronan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Harlow smiled. "I'm thinking about the night I found your mother in that alley. If I hadn't stopped, if I'd walked past her the way so many others would have, none of this would have happened. I wouldn't have this family, this love, this life." She turned to look at him. "My grandmother used to say, never step over someone who needs help because one day it might be you who needs someone to stop." She was right. I stopped for a stranger, and that stranger led me to a family. Ronan kissed her forehead. "Kindness is never wasted," he said. "It just needs time to bloom." Harlow nodded and rested her head against his chest. And flowers sometimes grow from the dark. Harlow and Ronan's story ends here, but its message lasts. It's a story about kindness, about sacrifice, about never losing faith in people. In this life, we often pass by those who need help without stopping, because we're too busy, too tired, or too afraid. But sometimes, one small act, one hand reaching out, one heart opening, can change someone's entire life. And who knows, it might change your life too. Thank you for listening to this story from beginning to end. If you feel it touched your heart, please tap the like button and share this video with the people you love. If you want to hear more moving stories like this every day, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. We'd truly love to know how you feel about Harlow and Ronan's story. Did it make you cry? Did it make you think about your own life? Have you ever met someone who needed help and stopped? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We're looking forward to hearing the stories from deep in your hearts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Remember, kindness is never wasted. It just needs time to bloom. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.